I think I've decided that all other options being exhausted, the best thing for me to be is just depressed. There. I've written it. Everyone will tell me to focus on the positives. But as far as my life goes, there haven't been any since the early 2000s. Since the year-and-a-half backpacking through Europe with Alan. Since that single, poor decision. An enthusiastic yes to a very dumb idea. Alan's idea. The reactor meltdown was almost 2 decades ago, he said. There's like barely any radiation by now. We could probably spend months there and be totally fine. He was trying to sell me on backpacking through Chernobyl. He didn't have to try very hard. He was talking 1,000 square miles of forbidden radio-ecological reserve dotted with quaint forgotten villages and massive ultra-low frequency broadcast arrays. And at the heart of it all, Pripyat, an entire city abandoned for decades in the wake of nuclear fallout. How could I resist? No more than a week. That was, sadly, my only condition. Radiation poisoning didn't seem like a great way to die, but a week's worth of damage seemed a small price to pay. The Chernobyl exclusion zone was lazily guarded. There were a few army outposts on the main roads, but for the most part, the military seemed to operate under the reasonable assumption that no one in their right mind would be trying to sneak in. We literally just walked right around them, keeping clear of the roads for as long as the outposts remained in sight. After about a half-mile or so trudging through overgrowth, the horizon overtook the outposts behind us and revealed the cityscape in front, freeing us to stroll at our leisure along the crumbling road to Pripyat. At first, the walk was no different to any other walk toward any other despondent city of the former Eastern Bloc. But as we drew in, things grew subtly stranger. The first thing we noticed were the trees, many of which seemed home to dozens of birds' nests each. Alan thought this curious, but we realized on further inspection that these were in fact parts of the trees themselves. Mutant outgrowths of very fine branches which incidentally looked like purpose-built birds' nests from afar. But they contained no birds. In fact, there were very few signs of any wildlife at all, until maybe 100 meters or so from the city entrance. These signs were limited mostly to the occasional dried bird droppings on the road in, which grew notably more frequent as we approached the city's border. It seemed pigeons preferred the safety of the buildings to the threat of hawks overhead, and so thousands of naturally occurring nests just outside the city limits lay unused. Alan and I had trekked throughout our fair share of abandoned cities before, war-torn or flooded or dried up or collapsed under the weight of economic busts, but none like Pripyat. Pripyat seemed an impossible place. In our first 10 minutes, we encountered trees growing up through the staircases of fully furnished buildings, an unfinished chess game in a dilapidated terrace, decrepit gas masks strewn about, and caked in decades of pollen and dust. Everything abandoned, but neither plundered nor damaged, untouched by anything but time. The Ferris wheel still standing, the shops still full of clothes, the library still full of books, the cinemas still full of propaganda. It was as if all the citizens of this bustling, functional city decided in sudden unison one day to simply leave and never return. It would almost seem ridiculous if it weren't precisely what had happened. Pigeons and mice and rats had since become the de facto tenants of the otherwise empty apartment buildings and hotels. Some had misshapen eyes, others malformed beaks or limbs of the wrong sizes or counts. Some seemed free of physical abnormality altogether, but common to all was a discernible lack of any instinct for self-preservation. Alan walked up to a pigeon and nudged it with his foot. The pigeon just stared at him, curiously at first, and then indifferently. Eventually it got bored of being nudged and waddled off to pick a fight with a rat, apparently over the feeding rights to the fresh corpse of another rat. The further we made it into the city, the more pigeon droppings seemed to line the streets. Stranger still, certain streets were covered in far more droppings than others, almost as if the pigeons preferred to travel along very specific routes. Following one of these dropping trails led us to an old hospital. The trail continued discernibly into the hospital entrance before taking a distinct left up the lobby stairs. "Why would pigeons use the stairs?" Alan asked. The trail continued past the second floor and up to the third. There was a fourth floor, but the pigeons had apparently been uninterested in it. The air in the third floor was oppressive with the stench of rot. There weren't any pigeons or rats immediately in sight, but across the sea of rusting hospital beds and cabinets of medical supplies, we could hear a great many of their coos and squeaks. Alan pinched his shirt over his nose and signaled for me to keep quiet. We crept toward the stench and the noise until we had a line of sight through the metal mangle of bed frames. The pigeons were resting on what appeared to be a severely bloated human corpse. There was an old rag doll splayed beside its motionless hand. "Jesus Christ," Alan whispered. "Do you think it's alive?" One of the pigeons began picking at the creature's graying, swollen bicep, tearing off flesh, eating whatever didn't fall down to the hive of rats that crawled up from down the carcass's pant legs and between its remaining toes. Liquid flowed from where the pigeon was picking, but it was thick and black and slow. "No," I said flatly. "No, I don't." Just as we were about to leave, the pigeon's picking seemed to hit something, and it suddenly found itself sprayed with a fresh burst of bright red blood. The bloated carcass grunted, flinched, and looked around until it noticed the bloodied pigeon still picking at its bicep. The weird carcass thing just stared at it for a few seconds. Then, in an impossibly quick movement, it grabbed the pigeon and bit off its head. The other pigeons didn't even flinch. We could hear the pigeon's skull being crushed between the thing's teeth. Alan vomited. The creature heard. It jumped up quickly, far too quickly, to its feet. Pigeons flew everywhere, and then it ran toward us. We started to run away, but Alan slipped in the pile of vomit at his feet. As I struggled to help him up, the bloated carcass thing stopped suddenly, turned around, ran back to where it had been sitting, pocketed the doll, then doubled back toward us again. We'd barely managed around the corner in the few seconds it took the bulging carcass to bound over the jungle of bed frames and plow through the medical cabinets to catch up with us. Its shoulder hit my back hard as it tackled Alan to the floor, and I went crashing through the window. The last thing I remember seeing was a brief glimpse of the creature hyperextending Alan's leg, like some choice piece of roast chicken. I don't remember landing in the crevice between the dumpster and the hospital, but that's where I found myself, in an alley in the middle of the night, covered in mice and moonlight and shards of broken, bloodied glass. With a fractured femur and a sprained left ankle and a mild concussion, I woke to the sounds of Alan's screams. I wasn't sure if I was going crazy, or if he was haunting me, or if he was still somehow alive. Alive and in pain and screaming for hours and hours on end as he wandered up and down the streets for some reason. That's what it sounded like. Obviously, the more likely explanation was the concussion, but if there was any chance he was alive and there was anything I could do to save him, I was damn well going to try. It took me several hours to hoist myself into the dumpster and fashion a leg brace and crutch from the refuse inside. As luck would have it, there was an old mercury thermometer in the dumpster. I broke the thermometer and pressed the mercury between a shard of glass and a piece of cardboard to serve as a surprisingly functional mirror. A way to see around corners seemed like just the thing I'd need if I were going to make it out of there on crutches. I could still hear Alan's screams as I crawled out of the dumpster. They slowly grew louder and louder while I practiced keeping balance on the brace and the crutch. When I felt like I'd gotten the hang of it, I made my way to the corner of the alley and used the mirror to look out into the courtyard and street. I could see the trail of bird droppings leading out from the hospital entrance and away from me. I sat there and waited as the screams grew closer. It wasn't until the twilight of dawn that the silhouette of the bulging creature became visible in the reflection of my mirror, making its way toward the hospital, dragging a large sack along the ground. Periodically, it would reach into the sack and pull out fistfuls of meat scraps, then toss them behind its back to the horde of hungry pigeons and rats that followed behind it. There was a subtle bounce to its step as it approached, as if it were leading a parade or having an especially pleasant day. All the while, Alan's screams grew louder. I thought maybe the thing had shoved Alan into the sack. For a moment, I imagined Alan crippled and dragged along the streets for hours, traumatized and screaming in the bag of animal carcasses. But then the creature pulled another fistful of scraps from the sack and tossed behind itself a human eyeball and a large chunk of human skull and scalp, with a tuft of hair roughly the same color and length as Alan's. So there was probably no way Alan was still alive. And yet Alan's screams grew louder and louder as the creature approached. It wasn't until the creature had made its way up to the hospital entrance that I could finally make out the details of its bloated face in the mirror. In its mouth was part of human spine, to which had been tied a long, meaty tube. I realized then, in a strange mixture of disgust, horror, and relief, that the sounds of Alan's screaming wasn't coming from the sack, but from the tube in the creature's mouth. There was no Alan, just his screams as the creature tooted its song throughout Pripyat, on a homemade instrument it had fashioned out of Alan's larynx. I managed to leave Pripyat after the creature fell asleep. I collapsed at some point on the hobble back toward the exclusion zone outposts. Shock and exhaustion and blood loss and the like, but I was found and rescued by patrols the following morning. My physical injuries healed quickly enough, though I'm skeptical that my soul will ever recover. To this day, I don't know what to make of my encounter with this creature, or of the creature itself. The playfulness in its step, the strange and fickle mixture of feral brutality and kindness it showed towards the pigeons and rats that followed it around, the doll, the trail of bird droppings leading to the hospital. Most signs seemed to imply that the creature had lived there since it was a child. My obsessive research since has served only to further corroborate this unsettling possibility. One of the nuclear plant workers was a single father of a chronically sick child. It would stand to reason that this child spent much of its time in the hospital. I say "it's" because the documents are in bad shape, and I can't determine the child's name or gender. When the plant exploded, nurses must have moved the child out of the children's ward to make room for the injured. Then, days later, when the extent of the radioactive fallout was made clear to the public, the child was forgotten in the hospital's rush to evacuate. With its father already dead from the explosion, there would have been no one to notice its absence. I'm often plagued by dreams of the child waking up, alone and bedridden and scared. Everyone it had ever known suddenly and inexplicably gone. The rats and pigeons and dolls its only friends and food for years. The radiation slowly mutating its flesh into a senseless mess of sporadic muscle growth and necrotic excess, until somehow, by some dark and twisted miracle, it found itself strong enough to leave its bed. I don't know if it still lurks the streets of Pripyat, if it quietly avoids the groups of people that enterprising tourist agencies have the years since been allowed to bus in for overnight stays. Maybe it has moved into the forests. More likely, it is simply dead, its body long ago buckling under the weight of its ever-growing cysts and lesions. After years undergoing every form of therapy known to modern psychiatry, I took a trip back to the Ukraine, traveling from orphanage to orphanage in a desperate search for some sort of closure, volunteering to help the orphan children of the Chernobyl power plant's victims. I had thought that maybe, if I saw enough children being cared for, if I did my part to care for them, I could come to terms with the horrible life that the creature must have lived. I could convince myself that the world had been balanced, that the universe showed kindness in proportion to its cruelty. I was denied even this modicum of solace. I found the children in these orphanages fed and watched over by struggling post-communist communities that never asked for the burden of caring for what they saw as invalids and genetic dead ends. caretakers who resented the children's material comforts sponsored by the generous orphanage donations of foreigners, material comforts which economic circumstance had denied the perfectly functional members of their own communities. The children were fed, watched over, and little more. Their lives consisted primarily of struggling and crying against their own defects and retardation and insanity, struggling on their own in plain view of indifferent adults, until they turned 18 and were cast into the world no one had prepared them for, informally doomed to the prisons and insanity wards through no fault of their own. Compared to what I saw in the orphanages, the creature was the lucky one, and so my dreams, once plagued only by the creature, are now plagued in addition by the orphanages it was lucky enough to avoid. So yes, I think my depression is appropriate. As for Alan, his memory seems distant these days. I never tried to tell his family, or even locate them. I can barely remember his face anymore. I'm haunted only by the memory of his screaming.